The bullet whistled past Willa Rutherford's ear so close she felt the heat of it against her skin. And in that moment of pure terror, she realized she couldn't remember the last time anyone had held her. The thought was absurd, considering she was currently pressed flat against the rough wooden planks of the general store's back wall, while three men exchanged gunfire in the dusty street of Red Cloud, Nebraska. It was June 1882, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small prairie town that had become her reluctant home 6 months ago. Willa's heart hammered against her ribs as another shot rang out, splintering the corner post just above her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, her arms wrapped tight around herself in a poor imitation of comfort. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed felt heavy and wrong. Willa's legs trembled as she slowly stood from her crouch, her dark blue cotton dress covered in dust. She was 22 years old, and somewhere along the way she had forgotten what it felt like to be touched with kindness. Her father had died 3 years ago, her mother a year before that. There had been no siblings, no extended family to speak of. Just Willa and a long string of boarding houses and temporary lodgings as she moved from town to town, working as a seamstress, a laundress, whatever, would keep food in her belly and a roof over her head. She peered around the corner carefully. 2 men lay motionless in the street, their bodies already gathering flies in the heat. The third man was riding hard out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. Willa pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. This was the 3rd shooting this month. Red Cloud wasn't the worst town she'd lived in, but it certainly wasn't the safest either. "Madam, you all right?" Willa jumped at the voice, spinning around so fast she nearly lost her balance. The man who stood before her was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. He wore dusty brown trousers, a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and a worn leather vest. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair and eyes the color of strong coffee. A silver star was pinned to his vest, catching the light. "I asked if you're all right," he repeated, his voice gentler this time. There was a slight drawl to his words, marking him as someone who'd spent time further south. "I'm fine," Willa managed, though her voice shook. "Just startled." More than startled, I'd say. He took a step closer, and Willa instinctively took a step back. Something flickered across his face, concern maybe, or recognition of her fear. He stopped moving toward her, and instead removed his hat, holding it in both hands. "Name's Flynn Eastwood. I'm the deputy here in Red Cloud. Been meaning to introduce myself proper, seeing as you've been in town a few months now." Willa studied him more carefully. She'd seen him around town, of course. It was impossible not to notice a man like Flynn Eastwood. He moved with a quiet confidence that drew the eye, and more than once she'd caught herself watching him from the window of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house where she rented a small room. But they'd never spoken directly. "Willa Rutherford," she said, straightening her spine and brushing ineffectively at the dust on her skirt. "I work at the boarding house, doing mending and laundry." "I know." At her surprised look, he added, "Small town. Hard not to know everyone's business, whether you want to or not." He glanced back at the bodies in the street, his jaw tightening. Those men have been causing trouble for weeks. Drifters, no ties to anyone, just looking to rob whoever they could. Sheriff's been tracking them, but they got the drop on him this morning. Winged him in the shoulder, nothing too serious, but he's laid up at Doc Morrison's. "Is he going to be all right?" Willa asked, though she barely knew Sheriff Wilcox beyond passing nods. "Doc says he'll be fine, just needs rest." Flynn's attention returned to her, and his gaze was so direct it made her breath catch. "You sure you're not hurt? That bullet came awful close." "I'm sure." But even as she said it, Willa became aware of a stinging sensation on her cheek. She reached up, and her fingers came away red. "Oh, you're bleeding." Flynn moved quickly, closing the distance between them before Willa could retreat again. "Hold still. Let me see." His hand came up toward her face, and Willa flinched hard, her whole body going rigid. Flynn froze immediately, his expression shifting to something pained. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "I promise. Just want to check that cut. Could be a splinter from the wood, or could be the bullet grazed you. Either way, it needs tending." Willa's heart was still racing, but she forced herself to nod. She didn't understand why she was so jumpy around this man specifically. She'd learned to be wary of everyone after years of fending for herself, but something about Flynn Eastwood made her feel dangerously vulnerable, like he might see straight through all her carefully constructed walls. His touch, when it came, was feather-light. His calloused fingers barely brushed her cheek as he tilted her face to examine the wound. Willa held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. "Splinter," Flynn announced after a moment. "Decent-sized one, too. We should get you to Doc Morrison's, have him pull it out proper and clean it up." "That's not necessary," Willa said quickly. "I can handle it myself." "Maybe so, but infection's nothing to mess with." His hand dropped away from her face, but he didn't step back. "When's the last time you saw a doctor, Miss Rutherford?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." "Humor me?" Willa thought back, trying to remember. 2 years, maybe 3. I don't get sick often. "And when's the last time someone took care of you when you were hurt?" The question was pointed, and the way he asked it made Willa's throat tight. "I take care of myself, Deputy Eastwood. I've been doing it for a long time." She tried to move past him, but he shifted slightly, not blocking her exactly, just making it clear he wasn't done with the conversation. "I don't doubt that for a second. I've seen you around town, seen how you carry yourself. You're strong, capable, but that doesn't mean you have to handle everything alone." He settled his hat back on his head and gestured toward the main street. "Come on, Doc's office is just down the way. I'll walk with you." "I said I'm fine. And I heard you." Flynn's tone was patient but firm. "But I'm still walking you to the doctor. Consider it part of my duties as deputy, making sure the citizens of Red Cloud are safe and healthy." Willa wanted to argue further, but she could feel the splinter throbbing in her cheek now that she was aware of it. And truthfully, the thought of walking through town alone right now, with 2 dead bodies still cooling in the street and a 3rd shooter on the loose, made her stomach turn. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin, "but I can pay for my own medical care." Something that might have been approval flickered in Flynn's dark eyes. Wouldn't expect anything different. They walked side by side down the narrow alley and emerged onto Main Street. A small crowd had gathered around the bodies, and the undertaker was already bringing his cart. Willa kept her eyes forward, not wanting to look at the dead men again. Flynn's presence beside her was oddly comforting, his long strides shortened to match her pace. Doc Morrison's office was on the north end of town, a small frame building with white paint peeling from years of harsh prairie weather. Flynn opened the door for her, and they stepped into the relative cool of the interior. The smell of carbolic acid and something herbal filled the air. "Doc," Flynn called out, "got another patient for you." A door at the back opened, and Dr. Morrison appeared, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. "Deputy Eastwood, I heard the shooting. Sheriff Wilcox is resting in the back room. Told him he needs to stay put for at least a few days, but you know how stubborn he is." "I'll talk to him," Flynn assured him. "But first, Miss Rutherford here caught a splinter from the shooting. Looks like it's in pretty deep." Doc Morrison's sharp eyes found Willa. "Well, come sit down, young lady. Let's have a look." Willa allowed herself to be guided to a chair by the window. The doctor leaned close, his examination quick and professional. "Good-sized splinter indeed. Going to need to pull it out with forceps. Might sting a bit." "I can handle it," Willa said. Doc Morrison smiled slightly. "I'm sure you can." He moved to a cabinet and began gathering supplies. Flynn remained standing near the door, his arms crossed over his chest, watching. "You don't have to stay," Willa told him. "I'm sure you have deputy duties to attend to." "I do," Flynn agreed. "But I'm attending to one right now, making sure you're taken care of." Before Willa could respond, Doc Morrison returned with a small tray of instruments. "This'll just take a minute. Try to hold still." The process was uncomfortable, but quick. Willa kept her eyes on the wall across from her, refusing to flinch as the doctor worked. She'd endured worse pain than this, much worse. When it was done, Doc Morrison cleaned the wound with something that burned and then applied a small bandage. "Keep it clean and dry," he instructed. "Change the bandage daily. Should heal up fine in a few days." "Thank you, doctor." Willa reached for her small reticule, where she kept her meager savings. "What do I owe you?" 2 bits should cover it." Willa counted out the coins carefully and placed them in his weathered palm. It was money she could ill afford to spend, but she'd learned long ago that debts, even small ones, could become chains around your neck if you weren't careful. Much obliged, Doc. Flynn pushed away from the wall. I'll check on the sheriff before I head out. He's awake if you want to talk to him. Grumpy as a bear with a sore paw, but awake. Flynn's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile, and Willa found herself staring at the expression, wondering what a real, full smile from this man would look like. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment before turning toward the back room. Willa stood quickly. Thank you again, Dr. Morrison. Deputy Eastwood. She was at the door when Flynn's voice stopped her. Miss Rutherford, wait just a moment. Willa turned reluctantly. Flynn had paused at the threshold of the back room, his expression serious. That third man, the one who rode out of town, we don't know where he went. Could be he's long gone. Could be he's holed up somewhere close by. I'd feel better if you stayed inside the boarding house for the rest of the day. No running errands, no going to the general store. Can you do that for me? I have work to do, Willa protested. Mrs. Patterson expects me to finish the mending for the Cooper family by tomorrow. I'm sure Mrs. Patterson will understand, given the circumstances. Flynn's tone was gentle but left no room for argument. Please, Miss Rutherford, just for today. Let me and my deputies do our job and make sure the town is secure. Willa wanted to argue, to insist that she couldn't afford to miss work, that she had responsibilities. But the memory of that bullet whizzing past her ear was still too fresh, and she found herself nodding. All right, just for today. Thank you. The relief in Flynn's voice was evident. I'll stop by the boarding house later, let you know when it's safe to move about freely again. Willa left the doctor's office and hurried back toward Mrs. Patterson's, keeping to the side of the street and jumping at every loud noise. The boarding house was a 2-story structure on the east side of town, painted a cheerful yellow that seemed at odds with the rough prairie landscape surrounding Red Cloud. Mrs. Patterson was a widow in her 50s who ran a tight ship, but she was fair and had given Willa a chance when others might not have. The older woman was waiting on the porch when Willa arrived, her plump face creased with worry. Oh, thank heavens, child. I heard the shooting and was worried sick. Are you hurt? Just a small cut, Mrs. Patterson. The doctor fixed me up. Willa climbed the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. The fear and adrenaline were wearing off, leaving her shaky and weak. Come inside. Let me make you some tea. Mrs. Patterson ushered her through the door, into the cool dimness of the front hall. The boarding house smelled of beeswax, and the bread Mrs. Patterson had been baking that morning. You look pale as a ghost. Willa allowed herself to be led to the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson bustled about making tea and pulling out leftover cornbread. The familiar routine was soothing, and Willa felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders as she sipped the hot, sweet tea. The deputy says I should stay inside for the rest of the day, Willa explained. One of the shooters got away. Mrs. Patterson clucked her tongue. Nasty business. This town's been too wild lately. We need more law around here, not less. She gave Willa a shrewd look. Deputy Eastwood saw to you personally, did he? He happened to be nearby when the shooting started, Willa said, not meeting the older woman's eyes. Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she didn't believe that was the whole story. That young man's been making excuses to walk past this house an awful lot lately. Noticed him looking up at your window more than once. Willa's cheeks heated. I'm sure you're mistaken. I may be getting old, child, but my eyes work just fine. Mrs. Patterson patted Willa's hand. He's a good man, Flynn Eastwood. Came to Red Cloud about 2 years back, after his parents passed. He's got a small ranch north of town, runs a few head of cattle, works as deputy to make extra money. Honest, hard-working, respectful. Could do a lot worse. I'm not looking for a husband, Mrs. Patterson. Willa's voice came out sharper than she intended. I've managed on my own this long. I don't need a man to take care of me. There's a difference between needing someone and wanting them, Mrs. Patterson said gently. And there's no shame in admitting you might like some companionship. We weren't meant to be alone, any of us. Willa thought about Flynn's question earlier, about the last time someone had taken care of her. She thought about his gentle touch when examining her wound, the way he'd waited to make sure she saw the doctor, the concern in his voice when he asked her to stay inside. And before she could stop herself, she thought about something else, something that had been haunting her lately in the quiet moments before sleep. She couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged her. The realization had hit her a few weeks ago, lying in her narrow bed in the small room Mrs. Patterson rented her. She'd been thinking about her childhood, about her parents, and suddenly she'd tried to remember the last time someone had embraced her with genuine affection. Her father, maybe at her mother's funeral, but he'd been so consumed by grief that the gesture had been perfunctory at best. Before that, she honestly couldn't say. Years, certainly. Maybe as many as 5 or 6. The thought made her feel hollow inside, like there was a piece of her missing that she hadn't even known was gone until now. "Child, you're crying." Mrs. Patterson's worried voice broke through Willa's thoughts. Willa reached up and was startled to find tears on her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, it's just been a difficult day. No need to apologize. You had a terrible scare." Mrs. Patterson stood and came around the table, and before Willa could protest, the older woman had wrapped her in a warm, motherly embrace. "There now, you're safe. Everything's going to be all right." The hug was so unexpected, so needed, that Willa felt something crack open inside her chest. She leaned into Mrs. Patterson's softness, breathing in the scent of flower and lavender, and let herself be comforted for just a moment. When Mrs. Patterson finally released her, Willa felt raw and exposed, but also lighter somehow. "Thank you," Willa whispered. "Anytime, dear." Mrs. Patterson squeezed her shoulder. "Now, why don't you go rest for a bit? I'll bring the Cooper mending to your room. You can work on it there, where it's safe." Willa nodded and made her way upstairs to her small room. It wasn't much, just a bed, a washstand, a small desk and chair by the window, and a trunk for her belongings. But it was hers, and it was clean and safe, and that was more than she'd had in some places. She sat at the desk and tried to focus on the mending Mrs. Patterson brought up, but her hands were shaking too badly to make neat stitches. Instead, she found herself staring out the window at the street below, watching the people of Red Cloud go about their business. The undertaker's cart passed by with its grim cargo. A woman hurried past with a basket of washing. 2 children chased a hoop down the dusty street laughing. Normal life, continuing despite the violence that had erupted earlier. That was the way of things out here on the prairie. Death and danger were constant companions, but life went on anyway. People adapted, grew hard shells to protect their soft insides. Willa had been doing it for years, but lately, that shell had started to feel more like a prison than protection. The afternoon wore on into evening. Mrs. Patterson brought up a dinner tray, which Willa picked at half-heartedly. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Willa heard the front door open downstairs and the low rumble of a male voice. Her heart skipped inexplicably. A moment later, there was a soft knock on her door. "Miss Rutherford, it's Deputy Eastwood. Mrs. Patterson said I could come up." Willa opened the door to find Flynn standing in the narrow hallway, his hat in his hands again. He looked tired, dust covering his clothes and face, but his eyes were alert and warm. "Wanted to let you know we caught the 3rd shooter," he said without preamble. "He was holed up in an abandoned soddy about 2 miles out of town. Surrendered without a fight once he realized we had him surrounded. He'll be transported to Grand Island for trial." "That's good news," Willa said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you for letting me know. How's your cheek?" Flynn's gaze went to the bandage, concern evident in his expression. "It's fine. Barely hurts at all." They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Flynn seemed to be struggling with something, opening his mouth and then closing it again. Finally, he said, "Miss Rutherford, I was wondering if I might call on you sometime. Properly, I mean. Maybe take you for a ride out to see the ranch, or to dinner at the hotel restaurant." Willa's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of solitude. But Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind, along with the memory of that brief hug in the kitchen, the realization of how long it had been since she'd allowed anyone close. And there was something in Flynn's eyes, a vulnerability that matched her own, that made her pause. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out before she could stop it. "Why would you want to call on me?" Flynn didn't seem offended by the blunt question. Instead, he considered it carefully before answering. "Because I see you around town, always working, always alone, and I recognize something in you. A kind of loneliness that I understand too well. Because you're beautiful, even though you don't seem to know it. Because when that bullet almost hit you today, my heart stopped, and I realized I wanted the chance to know you better." He paused, then added quietly, "Because I think maybe we could both use someone to talk to, someone who understands what it's like to be alone in a crowded town." The honesty in his words stole Willa's breath. She looked at this man, this almost stranger who somehow saw straight through her carefully constructed defenses, and made a decision that terrified her. "All right," she said softly. "You can call on me." The smile that broke across Flynn's face was like sunrise, warm and bright and full of promise. "Sunday afternoon, I could borrow a buggy from the livery, take you for a drive out to the ranch." "Sunday afternoon," Willa agreed. Flynn settled his hat back on his head, that smile still lingering at the corners of his mouth. "I'll pick you up at 2:00. Wear something comfortable for riding." After he left, Willa closed her door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. What had she just agreed to? She barely knew Flynn Eastwood. He could be anyone, could want anything from her. She should go downstairs right now and tell Mrs. Patterson to send word that she'd changed her mind, but she didn't. Instead, she moved to the window and watched as Flynn emerged from the boarding house and walked down the street toward the sheriff's office, his stride confident and easy. He paused once to look back at her window, and even from this distance Willa could see his smile. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe there was a difference between needing someone and wanting them. And maybe, just maybe, Willa was tired of being alone. The days between that evening and Sunday afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Willa threw herself into her work, mending clothes, washing linens, helping Mrs. Patterson with the cooking and cleaning, but her mind kept drifting to Sunday, to Flynn Eastwood and his dark eyes and gentle hands. She saw him around town a few times. Once, he was breaking up a dispute between two ranchers outside the saloon. Another time, he was helping old Mrs. Henderson carry her groceries home. Each time, he caught sight of Willa and tipped his hat, his expression warm, and each time, Willa felt that strange flutter in her chest, equal parts anticipation and fear. "Saturday evening, Mrs." Patterson helped her press her best dress, a simple cotton frock in a soft green that brought out the hazel in Willa's eyes. "You'll look lovely," Mrs. Patterson assured her. "That young man won't be able to take his eyes off you." "It's just a drive to his ranch," Willa protested, but she couldn't quite suppress her smile. Sunday morning, Willa barely touched her breakfast. She bathed carefully, using the last of her lavender soap, and arranged her long brown hair in a simple style that wouldn't be destroyed by the prairie wind. The green dress fit her well, emphasizing her slim waist and the gentle curves she usually hid under more practical clothing. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. When had she last bothered to look pretty? When had she last cared? At precisely 2:00, there was a knock at the front door. Willa heard Mrs. Patterson answer it, heard Flynn's deep voice in the entryway. She took a deep breath, grabbed her shawl, and headed downstairs. Flynn was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and the expression on his face when he saw her made every moment of preparation worthwhile. He looked stunned, his eyes widening and his lips parting slightly. "Miss Rutherford, you look beautiful." "Thank you." Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You clean up nicely yourself, Deputy Eastwood." He did look good, she had to admit. He'd traded his usual dusty work clothes for dark trousers, a clean white shirt, and a black vest. His boots were polished, his hair neatly combed. He still wore his deputy's star, though, and Willa found that somehow reassuring. "Shall we?" Flynn offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Willa took it. The buggy waiting outside was well maintained, pulled by a handsome sorrel mare. Flynn helped Willa up onto the seat with a gentlemanly hand, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the boarding house, Willa was acutely aware of the curious stares following them. Red Cloud was a small town, and by tomorrow morning everyone would know that Deputy Eastwood was courting the quiet seamstress from Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. They rode in silence for a while, heading north out of town into the rolling prairie. The June day was warm, but not unbearably hot, and a steady breeze kept the worst of the heat at bay. Wildflowers dotted the grassland, splashes of purple and yellow against the endless green. Above them, the sky stretched impossibly wide and blue, broken only by a few wispy clouds. "It's beautiful out here," Willa said after a while, surprising herself with the words. "I think so," Flynn agreed. "It was one of the things that made me fall in love with Nebraska. The sky, the space, room to breathe." He glanced at her. "You're not from around here originally, are you?" "No, I was born in Illinois, near Springfield." My father was a teacher. Willa found herself talking more freely than she had in years. After my mother died, we moved around a lot. He couldn't seem to settle anywhere. Then he passed, and I've been on my own ever since. I'm sorry. That must have been hard. It was what it was. Willa shrugged, uncomfortable with the sympathy in his voice. What about you? Mrs. Patterson mentioned your parents passed? About 3 years ago. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Flynn's hands tightened on the reins. They had a small ranch in Kansas. After they died, I sold it and came up here. Wanted a fresh start. Bought some land, started building my own spread. It's not much yet, but it's mine. Is that what you've always wanted? To be a rancher? Among other things. Flynn's mouth curved in a slight smile. I like working with my hands, building something that'll last. The deputy work, that's just to make ends meet while I get the ranch established. But yeah, someday I'd like to have a real operation. Cattle, horses, maybe some crops. A house instead of the cabin I've got now. A family. The last word hung between them, heavy with implication. Willa felt her heart rate pick up. That sounds nice, she managed. They crested a rise and Flynn pulled the buggy to a stop, gesturing at the view before them. Willa caught her breath. A small valley spread out below, green and lush, with a creek winding through the middle of it. Near the creek stood a small log cabin with a lean-to barn beside it. A split-rail fence enclosed a modest corral where several horses grazed. It was simple, rough even, but there was something appealing about it, something honest. That's home, Flynn said, and there was pride in his voice. Not much to look at yet, but it's mine. Built that cabin with my own hands, every log, the barn too. It's wonderful, Willa said honestly. You should be proud. They drove down into the valley, and Flynn helped her down from the buggy. Up close, the cabin was even more impressive. The logs were carefully fitted, the roof looked solid, and the small porch was swept clean. Flynn led her inside, and Willa was surprised by how tidy it was. A simple bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs near the stone fireplace, shelves holding supplies and a few books. It smelled of wood smoke and leather and something else, something uniquely Flynn. I know it's not fancy, Flynn said, suddenly seeming nervous, but it's comfortable enough. It's perfect, Willa assured him, and she meant it. There was something appealing about this little cabin, about the evidence of hard work and care in every corner. You've done well for yourself, Flynn. The use of his first name seemed to surprise them both. Flynn's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that made Willa's breath catch. Would you like to see the rest of the property? Flynn asked, his voice slightly rough. I could saddle up a couple of horses, take you riding along the creek. I don't know how to ride, Willa admitted. Never learned. That's all right. You can ride with me, if you're comfortable with that. The thought of sitting that close to Flynn, of being held by him, sent a shiver through Willa that had nothing to do with cold. All right, she heard herself say. Flynn saddled a sturdy bay gelding and then helped Willa mount, lifting her easily onto the horse's back before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and Willa found herself surrounded by his warmth, his scent. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he must feel it. They rode slowly along the creek, Flynn pointing out the boundaries of his property, his plans for the future. He wanted to build a larger barn, expand the corral, maybe put in a vegetable garden near the cabin. His voice was animated when he talked about his dreams, and Willa found herself caught up in his enthusiasm. Sorry, Flynn said after a while, sounding embarrassed. I'm talking your ear off. No, I like hearing about it. And she did, Willa realized. She liked the way his voice rumbled through his chest into her back, where she leaned against him. She liked the strength of his arms around her, the security of his presence. She liked feeling, for the first time in years, like she was part of something, like someone cared whether she was there or not. They stopped near a bend in the creek where cottonwood trees provided shade. Flynn dismounted first, then reached up to help Willa down. His hand spanned her waist, strong and sure, and he lowered her carefully to the ground. For a moment, they stood there, barely inches apart, his hands still on her waist and her hands resting on his shoulders. Willa, Flynn said softly, I need to tell you something. What? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. I wasn't just passing by when that shooting happened. I'd been watching the boarding house, waiting to see if you'd come outside. I wanted to talk to you, had been working up the nerve for weeks." His dark eyes searched her face. "When those men started shooting and you were right there in the line of fire, I've never been so scared in my life. And I realized I couldn't wait anymore, couldn't keep making excuses to walk past and hoping you'd notice me. Life's too short and too uncertain out here to waste time." Willa's breath had stopped somewhere around the word scared. No one had been scared for her in so long. No one had cared enough to worry. "Flynn, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know, I like you, Willa Rutherford. I like your strength and your independence and the way you hold yourself, like you're ready to take on the world. But I also see the loneliness in you because I feel it too. And I thought maybe, if you're willing, we could be lonely together. Or better yet, maybe we could stop being lonely at all." Something inside Willa cracked wide open, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. All the loneliness, all the years of holding everyone at arm's length, all the fear and self-protection, it all came flooding out in a rush. And before she could think better of it, before fear could stop her, she was leaning forward and pressing her face against Flynn's chest, her hands fisting in his shirt. Flynn went very still for a moment, and then his arms came around her, strong and sure and gentle all at once. He held her carefully at first, as if afraid she might break or bolt. But when Willa didn't pull away, his embrace tightened, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. "When's the last time someone hugged you?" he asked softly, and Willa realized he was echoing his question from days ago, the one about when someone had taken care of her. "I don't know," Willa whispered against his shirt. "Years. Too many years." "I'm fixing that problem right now," Flynn said, his voice firm but tender. "Hold still." And he did. He stood there in the shade of the cottonwoods, holding Willa Rutherford like she was something precious, while she remembered what it felt like to be touched with kindness. She could hear his heartbeat under her ear, steady and strong, could feel the rise and fall of his chest with each breath, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather and horse and man. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. When Willa finally pulled back, her eyes were wet with tears she hadn't meant to shed. Flynn reached up and gently brushed them away with his thumbs, his hands cupping her face with infinite care. "I'm sorry," Willa said, embarrassed. "I don't know what came over me. Don't apologize. Not ever. Not for this." Flynn's eyes were intense, almost fierce. "Everyone needs to be held sometimes. Everyone needs to know they matter to someone. You matter to me, Willa. I need you to know that." "But you barely know me," Willa protested weakly. "Then let me get to know you better. Let me court you properly. Let me show you that not everyone leaves, that some people stay." His voice dropped. "Let me teach you what it feels like to be cared for again." Willa looked up at this man, this near stranger who somehow saw straight to her heart and made a decision that would change everything. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Flynn's smile was radiant. And then he was leaning down, and Willa was rising up on her toes, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was Willa's first kiss, though she'd never admitted that to anyone, and it was perfect in its simplicity. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I've been wanting to do that since the first time I saw you," Flynn admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "When was that?" Willa asked, curious. 6 months ago, the day you arrived in Red Cloud. You were standing outside the general store looking lost and determined all at once. I walked past you 3 times trying to work up the nerve to introduce myself, but you looked like you might bite if anyone got too close." Willa laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she'd laughed? "I probably would have. I didn't come to Red Cloud looking for romance." "What were you looking for?" "A place to stop running," Willa said honestly. "A place that might feel like home." "Did you find it?" Flynn's hands had settled at her waist again, holding her close. Willa looked around at the prairie stretching in all directions, at the creek bubbling past, at the little cabin visible in the distance. Then she looked back at Flynn, at the hope and warmth in his dark eyes. "I think I might be starting to." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the ranch. Flynn showed her the horses, let her feed them handfuls of grain, and laughed when she jumped at the velvet softness of their noses against her palms. He took her to the creek, and they sat on the bank, shoes off and feet in the cool water, and talked about everything and nothing. Willa found herself opening up in ways she never had before, telling Flynn about her childhood, her parents, the years of wandering. In turn, he told her about growing up in Kansas, about his parents and their dreams for him, about the grief and loneliness that had driven him north to Nebraska. "Sometimes I think we're all just looking for the same thing," Flynn said as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. "A place to belong. People who care if we live or die. A reason to keep going." "And have you found it?" Willa asked, echoing his question from earlier. Flynn looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart skip. "I'm starting to think I might have." The ride back to town was slower than the ride out had been, as if neither of them wanted the afternoon to end. Flynn kept one arm around Willa as he drove, and she let herself lean against his solid warmth, marveling at how quickly she'd grown comfortable with his touch. A week ago, she would have flinched away. Now, she found herself craving more contact, more of the warmth and security he offered. When they arrived back at the boarding house, the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. Flynn helped Willa down from the buggy and walked her to the door, still holding her hand. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "Soon?" "When?" Willa found she didn't want to wait long. "Tomorrow? I could come by in the evening after my shift. We could take a walk or sit on the porch and talk." "I'd like that." Flynn lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture courtly and sweet. "Until tomorrow, then." Willa watched him drive away, her hand still tingling where he'd kissed it. When she finally went inside, Mrs. Patterson was waiting with a knowing smile. "Good afternoon?" the older woman asked innocently. "Very good," Willa admitted, unable to keep the smile off her face. "I told you he was a good man." "You did." Willa sank into a chair at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted, but in the best way. "Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "How do you know when it's real, when it's not just loneliness or convenience, but actual love?" Mrs. Patterson considered the question thoughtfully. "I think real love makes you want to be a better person. It doesn't complete you because you should already be complete on your own. But it enhances you, makes the colors brighter and the world bigger. Real love feels like coming home after a long journey. It feels safe and exciting, all at once." She reached across the table and patted Willa's hand. "And I think you know in your gut, even if your head tries to talk you out of it." Willa thought about the afternoon, about the way she'd felt in Flynn's arms, about the ease of their conversation and the warmth of his smile, about how, for the first time in years, she'd felt truly seen and valued. "I think I might be falling in love with him," she admitted quietly. "I know, dear, I could see it in your eyes when you came downstairs earlier." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "Now the question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know. I've never done this before. I don't know how to be in a relationship, how to let someone close." "You learn as you go," Mrs. Patterson assured her, "and you trust your heart. Flynn Eastwood is a good man, and I think he'll be patient with you while you figure things out." True to his word, Flynn came by the next evening after his shift. They sat on the porch swing, talking and watching the stars come out. He held her hand the whole time, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. When he kissed her goodnight, it was longer and deeper than the first time, and Willa felt it all the way to her toes. The pattern repeated over the following weeks. Flynn would come by in the evenings when he wasn't working late, and they'd walk through town or sit on the porch or sometimes ride out to the ranch. On Sundays, Flynn would pick her up after church, and they'd spend the afternoon together, sometimes working on improvements to the cabin, sometimes just enjoying each other's company. Willa found herself blossoming under Flynn's attention. The wary, guarded woman who'd arrived in Red Cloud 6 months ago was gradually replaced by someone softer, happier. She smiled more, laughed easier. The other residents of the boarding house noticed the change, and more than one commented on how well courting seemed to suit her. But it wasn't always easy. There were moments when Willa's old fears would resurface, when she'd pull away or put up walls without meaning to. Flynn was endlessly patient with her, never pushing, always giving her the space she needed while making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. One evening in late July, they were sitting by the creek at Flynn's ranch when Willa finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Why me, Flynn? You could court any woman in Red Cloud. Half of them are prettier than me, and most of them know how to do things like cook and keep house properly. So, why choose the broken girl from the boarding house?" Flynn was quiet for a long moment, his arm around her shoulders and his gaze on the water. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. First, you're not broken, you're wounded, and that's different. Broken things can't be fixed. Wounded things heal, given time and care. And second, I didn't choose you because I thought you'd be easy or convenient. I chose you because when I look at you, I see someone who's survived things that would have destroyed a weaker person. I see strength and determination and a fierce independence that I admire. I see someone worth knowing, worth fighting for. He turned to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. But mostly, I chose you because my heart did. Because when I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before. Because you make me want to be better, do better. Because the thought of a future without you in it feels empty and wrong. Willa felt tears prick her eyes. I'm scared, she admitted in a whisper. I'm scared of needing you too much. I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared of not being good enough. I'm scared too, Flynn confessed. Scared of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, pushing too hard or not hard enough. Scared that one day you'll realize you don't need me and leave. But you know what I'm more scared of? What? Never taking the chance, never knowing what we could be together. That scares me more than anything. His thumb brushed away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. So I'm asking you, Willa Rutherford, to be brave with me, to take this chance, to let yourself be loved. The word hung between them, spoken aloud for the first time. Love. Willa looked into Flynn's dark eyes and saw the truth of it there, saw the depth of his feeling reflected back at her. And she realized that somewhere along the way, she'd fallen completely and irrevocably in love with this man. I love you, she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. I'm terrified and I don't know what I'm doing, but I love you, Flynn Eastwood. Flynn's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. I love you too. I have for weeks, but I didn't want to scare you by saying it too soon. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Willa kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said, and it wasn't really a question. Willa's heart stopped. What? Marry me. Be my wife. Build a life with me here. Flynn pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. I know it's fast, and I know you're scared, but I also know what I want. I want you, Willa. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build this ranch with you, make a home with you, have a family with you. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life showing you what it means to be loved. Flynn, Willa's mind was racing. Marriage. She'd never really let herself think about marriage, about permanence. It seemed too much to hope for, too far out of reach for someone like her. You don't have to answer right now, Flynn said quickly, seeing her panic. Take time to think about it, but know that I'm serious and I'm not going anywhere. Whether you say yes tomorrow or a year from now, I'll be here, waiting. Willa looked at this man who'd somehow seen past all her defenses, who'd held her when she couldn't remember the last hug, who'd been patient and kind and steadfast. And she realized she didn't need time to think. She knew what she wanted. Yes, she said firmly. Yes, I'll marry you. Flynn looked stunned for a moment, as if he hadn't really expected her to agree so quickly. Then joy spread across his face, and he was kissing her again, laughing against her lips. Really, you're sure? I'm sure. I'm terrified, but I'm sure. Willa laughed too, giddy with the enormity of what she'd just agreed to. When? As soon as possible. Tomorrow if we could. But I suppose we should do it properly. Flynn was grinning like a fool, and Willa realized she probably looked the same. A month? Would that give you enough time to prepare? I don't need much, just you and me and someone to perform the ceremony. We'll do it right, Flynn insisted. You deserve a real wedding, with a dress and flowers and all the trimmings. We'll invite the whole town, have a celebration at the hotel. Flynn, I can't afford. Let me do this for you, he interrupted gently. Let me give you a day to remember. A day that shows everyone how much you mean to me. Please. How could she refuse when he looked at her like that? All right, a real wedding, but nothing too fancy. Nothing too fancy, Flynn agreed. Just perfect. They rode back to town in a daze, both of them unable to stop smiling. When Flynn walked Willa to the boarding house door, he kissed her thoroughly, not caring who might see. My future wife, he murmured against her lips, and Willa felt a thrill run through her at the words. Mrs. Patterson took one look at Willa's face when she came inside and clapped her hands together in delight. He proposed. He did, and I said yes. Willa couldn't keep the wonder out of her voice. Oh, child, I'm so happy for you. Mrs. Patterson pulled her into a warm hug, and Willa returned it easily now, no longer flinching from affection. We have so much to do, a dress to make, a cake to bake, flowers to arrange. When's the wedding? A month from now, August 28th. Perfect. That gives us just enough time. Mrs. Patterson was already making mental lists, Willa could tell. We'll make you the most beautiful bride Red Cloud has ever seen. The next month passed in a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Patterson recruited several of the other women in town to help with preparations. They sewed Willa a wedding dress of soft ivory cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but lovely. The hotel agreed to host the reception, and the whole town seemed caught up in the excitement of the upcoming wedding. Flynn was busy too, making improvements to the cabin and adding a new room so there'd be space for a proper bedroom separate from the living area. He built a real bed frame to replace the simple cot he'd been using and ordered a mattress from Grand Island. Every evening he'd come by the boarding house, exhausted and covered in sawdust, but grinning at the progress he was making. I want it to be perfect for you, he told Willa one evening as they sat on the porch. I want you to feel like it's your home, not just mine. Anywhere you are will feel like home, Willa assured him, and meant it. As the wedding date approached, Willa found herself growing nervous for entirely different reasons than her usual fears. She worried about the wedding night, about the physical intimacy she'd never experienced. Mrs. Patterson, sensing her anxiety, sat her down a few days before the wedding and explained what to expect, answering Willa's embarrassed questions with gentle honesty. Flynn loves you? Mrs. Patterson reminded her. He'll be gentle and patient, and remember, it's natural and right between a husband and wife. Don't be afraid of it. The night before the wedding, Willa barely slept. She lay in her small bed at the boarding house for the last time, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night, and thought about how much her life was about to change. Tomorrow, she would be Mrs. Flynn Eastwood. Tomorrow, she would leave this room and move out to the ranch, begin building a life with the man she loved. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of, and it was terrifying and wonderful all at once. The morning of August 28th dawned clear and warm. Mrs. Patterson helped Willa bathe and dress, arranging her hair in an elegant style threaded with wildflowers. When Willa looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the radiant woman staring back at her. She looked happy, she realized, truly, genuinely happy. The ceremony was held at the small church on the edge of town, with most of Red Cloud in attendance. Willa walked down the aisle alone, having no family to give her away, but she held her head high. When she reached the front of the church and saw Flynn waiting for her, looking handsome in a new black suit, her nervousness melted away. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Willa heard herself reciting vows, felt Flynn slide a simple gold band onto her finger, heard the preacher pronounce them husband and wife, and then Flynn was kissing her, and everyone was cheering, and Willa felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The reception at the hotel was lively, with food and music and dancing. Flynn never left Willa's side, one arm always around her waist, as if he couldn't bear to let her go. They danced together while the small band played, and Willa thought about how, a few months ago, she would have been too afraid to be held like this, too wary to let someone this close. Now, wrapped in Flynn's arms, she felt safer than she ever had in her life. As the sun began to set, Flynn leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Eastwood. Mrs. Eastwood." Willa tested the name in her mind and found she loved the sound of it. "Yes," she whispered back. "Let's go home." They said their goodbyes and climbed into the buggy Flynn had decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. The drive out to the ranch felt both endless and too short. Willa's nervousness was returning, but Flynn must have sensed it because he kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out changes he'd made to the property, telling her about his plans for the future. When they arrived at the cabin, Flynn surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her across the threshold. Tradition, he explained with a grin, and Willa laughed, clinging to his neck. He set her down gently in the middle of the main room, and Willa looked around in wonder, The cabin had been transformed. Curtains hung at the windows, a colorful rag rug covered the floor, and fresh wildflowers sat in a jar on the table. Through the open door to the new bedroom, Willa could see the bed Flynn had built, covered in a beautiful quilt. "Flynn, it's wonderful," she breathed. "I wanted you to feel welcome here. Wanted you to know this is your home now, as much as mine." He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "Are you happy?" "So happy I'm afraid I might be dreaming." Willa leaned back against his solid warmth. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and be back in my little room at the boarding house, and this will all have been a wonderful dream." "Not a dream. This is real, and it's forever." Flynn turned her in his arms so she was facing him. "I love you, Willa Eastwood." "I love you too." And then they were kissing, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more needy. Flynn's hands tangled in her hair, dislodging the careful arrangement and sending wildflowers falling to the floor. Willa didn't care. She pressed closer, her own hands exploring the broad expanse of his back through the fabric of his suit jacket. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Flynn's eyes were dark with desire. "Willa, if you're not ready, we can wait. I don't want to rush you." In answer, Willa took his hand and led him toward the bedroom. "I'm ready. I'm nervous, but I'm ready. I trust you." What followed was tender and sweet, with Flynn being as gentle and patient as Mrs. Patterson had promised. He took his time, making sure Willa was comfortable, murmuring words of love and encouragement. There was some pain, as she'd been warned there would be, but it was overshadowed by the intimacy of the moment, the feeling of being completely joined with this man she loved. Afterward, Flynn held her close, her head resting on his chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "More than all right." Willa pressed a kiss to his chest. "That was perfect. It'll get even better," Flynn promised. "As we learn each other, figure out what we both like." They lay there in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, and Willa thought about how far she'd come. A few months ago, she couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged her. Now she was lying in bed with her husband, safe and loved and completely content. It felt like a miracle. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Willa had lived alone for so long that sharing space with someone took getting used to. Flynn was patient with her moods, giving her space when she needed it, but always making sure she knew he was there. They developed routines together, learning to move around each other in the small cabin, figuring out the rhythm of married life. Willa discovered she liked taking care of Flynn, liked cooking his meals and mending his clothes and keeping their home tidy. It was different from the work she'd done at the boarding house. This felt meaningful, personal, like she was building something that mattered. Flynn, in turn, made sure Willa knew she was appreciated, always thanking her for the work she did and helping whenever he could. They worked side by side on the ranch, too. Willa learned to milk the cow Flynn bought, to gather eggs from the chickens, to tend the vegetable garden they planted together. Her hands, which had been soft from seamstress work, grew calloused from ranch labor, but she didn't mind. This was honest work, building a life and a future. In the evenings, they'd sit together on the porch Flynn had expanded, watching the sun set over the prairie. Sometimes they'd talk about their days, sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence. And always, Flynn would hold her, his arms around her waist and her back against his chest. And Willa would marvel at how natural it felt now, being touched, being held. The physical side of their marriage grew easier and more satisfying as well. Flynn was an attentive lover, always making sure Willa was satisfied, and she found herself growing bolder, more confident in expressing what she wanted. The intimacy they shared was healing in ways Willa hadn't expected, helping her shed the last of her fears about being touched, about being vulnerable with another person. As autumn arrived, painting the prairie in shades of gold and bronze, Willa realized she was happier than she'd ever been in her life. The loneliness that had haunted her for so long was completely gone, replaced by a sense of belonging that went bone deep. This was home. Flynn was home. One October evening, as they sat together after dinner, Willa turned to her husband and said, "Thank you." Flynn looked surprised. "For what?" "For seeing me when I didn't think anyone could, for being patient with me, for loving me even when I was too scared to let you close." Willa took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "For fixing the problem when I couldn't remember the last time someone hugged me." Flynn's expression softened, and he pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her in the embrace that had become as natural as breathing. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, every day if you need it. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget what it feels like to be loved. And he did. Through that first winter, when snow blanketed the prairie and they spent long evenings curled up together by the fire, through the following spring, when they planted crops and Willa discovered she was expecting their first child, through the summer heat, when Flynn doted on her as her belly swelled, treating her like she was made of glass even though she insisted she could still do most of her regular work. Their son was born in late September of 1883, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. They named him Samuel after Flynn's father, and Willa thought her heart might burst from the love she felt holding her child for the first time. Flynn was beside himself with joy, spending hours just staring at his son in wonder. "We made this," he kept saying, his voice full of awe. "This perfect little person, we made him together." Watching Flynn with Samuel, seeing the tenderness with which he held their baby, Willa fell in love with her husband all over again. He was a devoted father, waking in the night to help with feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing soft lullabies in his deep voice that soothed Samuel to sleep. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Flynn expanded the herd, bought more land, built a larger barn. Willa managed the household and the garden, which now produced enough vegetables to sell at the market in town. They saved every spare penny, planning for the future. When Samuel was 2, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, a tiny, delicate baby with blonde curls and blue eyes. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. And Flynn joked that they'd need to build an addition to the cabin if they kept having children. But they both wanted more, wanted a house full of love and laughter, the kind of family neither of them had really had growing up. So when Grace was 18 months old and Willa found herself pregnant a third time, they were delighted. This pregnancy resulted in twin boys, Thomas and James, who arrived squalling into the world in the spring of 1888. The cabin, which had once seemed perfectly adequate, was now bursting at the seams with 4 children. Flynn made good on his promise to build an addition, this time creating a full second story with bedrooms for the children. But it quickly became apparent that what they really needed was a new house entirely. "A real house," Flynn said one evening after the children were asleep. "Something that'll last, that we can hand down to our children and grandchildren. What do you think?" "I think it sounds wonderful," Willa said, though she worried about the cost. "Can we afford it?" "I've been saving for years," Flynn assured her. "The ranch is doing well, and I've got enough put by. We can hire some help, get it built by winter. I want you to have a proper house, Willa. You deserve it." The new house went up that summer, a beautiful 2-story frame structure with a wraparound porch, large windows, and enough bedrooms for their growing family. It had a real kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a parlor for entertaining, and even indoor plumbing, a luxury that still amazed Willa every time she turned on the tap. When they moved in that fall, Willa walked through the rooms and cried happy tears. "It's too much," she told Flynn. "It's too beautiful." "Nothing's too much for you," Flynn said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, a gesture that had become their signature embrace over the years. "You're the reason for all of this, Willa. You and the children. You're the reason I get up every morning and work as hard as I do. This house, this life, it's all for you." The years continued to pass in a blur of happy chaos. The children grew, each with their own personality and talents. Samuel was steady and responsible, already showing an interest in ranching like his father. Grace was creative and dreamy, always drawing or making up stories. The twins were rambunctious and mischievous, keeping Willa on her toes. In 1891, Willa gave birth to their 5th and final child, a daughter they named Margaret after Willa's mother. By this time, Flynn had stepped down from his deputy position to focus full-time on the ranch, which had grown into one of the most successful operations in the county. They employed several ranch hands, and the house was always full of activity. Through it all, Flynn and Willa's love only deepened. They'd learned each other so well over the years that sometimes they barely needed words to communicate. A look, a touch, was enough. And Flynn never forgot his promise to make sure Willa always felt loved. Every day without fail, he found moments to hold her, to pull her into his arms and remind her that she was cherished. One evening in the summer of 1895, when Margaret was 4 and the older children were helping with chores. Willa and Flynn found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sunset as they had so many times before. Willa leaned back against Flynn's chest, his arms around her waist, perfectly content. "Do you ever think about that day we met?" Flynn asked softly. "When those men were shooting and you were pressed against the wall of the general store?" "Sometimes," Willa admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like that was a different person entirely." "In some ways, it was." Flynn pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That woman was so scared, so alone. She couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged her." "And you fixed that problem," Willa said, smiling at the memory. "You told me to hold still, and you fixed it right then and there." "Best decision I ever made," Flynn said. "Though technically, you're the one who made the decision. You could have run away, kept those walls up. But you didn't. You chose to trust me, to let me in. That took incredible courage." Willa turned in his arms so she could see his face. At 35, Flynn was more handsome than ever, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes still full of warmth and love. Silver was starting to show at his temples, and Willa found she liked it. It made him look distinguished, mature. "I love you," she said simply. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too." Flynn cupped her face in his hands, the gesture as familiar and beloved as breathing. "Thank you for saying yes that day by the creek. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for giving me this life, these children, this incredible family. You're everything to me, Willa Eastwood. Everything." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. From inside the house came the sound of their children laughing, and somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and wild and home. Later that night, after the children were asleep and Flynn and Willa lay in their bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Willa thought about how far she'd come. From the lonely, frightened girl who couldn't remember the last hug, to this, surrounded by love and family and purpose. Sometimes life took you places you never expected, gave you things you never dared to dream of. All you had to do was be brave enough to reach for it. "What are you thinking about?" Flynn murmured against her hair. "How happy I am," Willa said honestly. "How grateful I am that you were there that day, that you saw me, really saw me. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't." "You'd have been fine," Flynn said with certainty. "You're the strongest person I know, Willa. You'd have survived. You always do. But I'm grateful too, that I got the chance to be part of your life, to love you, to build this with you." They fell asleep like that, as they did every night, holding each other close. And if sometimes Willa still marveled at the miracle of it, at the way Flynn's arms felt like home, at the security and love that surrounded her now, well, that was all right. Some gifts were too precious to ever take for granted. The years continued to unfold in seasons of planting and harvest, of children growing and the ranch prospering. Samuel eventually took over much of the daily ranch operations, allowing Flynn to slow down a bit as he got older. Grace married a banker from Grand Island and moved away. Though she visited often with her own children, the twins both stayed in Red Cloud, one becoming a blacksmith and the other opening a general store. Margaret, the baby, surprised everyone by announcing her intention to become a teacher, just like her grandfather had been. Through it all, Flynn and Willa remained the steady center of their expanding family. They grew old together, their bodies aging, but their love remaining constant. Flynn's hair went completely silver, Willa's face lined with wrinkles, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been that day by the creek when Flynn had asked Willa to marry him. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the house. The whole town turned out, wanting to honor the couple who'd become pillars of the Red Cloud community. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and more food than anyone could possibly eat. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Flynn and Willa found themselves alone on the porch once again, watching the stars come out. Willa was nestled in her favorite spot, her back against Flynn's chest and his arms around her waist. 25 years, Flynn said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "I know what you mean." Willa laced her fingers through his where they rested on her stomach. "I can't imagine my life without you in it, Flynn. Can't even remember what it was like before." "Lonely?" Flynn said softly. for both of us. But we found each other, and that made all the difference. Willa thought about the girl she'd been, standing outside the general store in Red Cloud for the first time, lost and alone and wary of everyone. She thought about Flynn, seeing her, and recognizing something of himself in her loneliness. She thought about that first hug by the creek, the way it had cracked open something inside her that she'd kept locked away for too long. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Willa said. "That shooting, the day we met. If those men hadn't chosen that exact moment to start trouble, if I'd been somewhere else in town, if you'd been busy with something else, we might never have spoken. Our whole life together hangs on that one moment of chance." "I don't think it was chance," Flynn said firmly. "I think it was fate. I think we were meant to find each other, one way or another. Maybe not that exact day, but somehow, some way. Some things are just meant to be." Willa turned to look at her husband, at the man who'd shown her what love truly meant, who'd taught her that being vulnerable wasn't weakness but strength, who'd kept his promise to make sure she never forgot what it felt like to be cherished. "I believe that too," she said softly. They sat there in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, holding each other as they had held each other thousands of times before. And Willa knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter how many more years they were granted together, she would never tire of this, of being in Flynn's arms, of being loved and loving in return. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, the same wild landscape it had always been. But it didn't seem lonely anymore, not to Willa, because she'd learned finally that home wasn't a place. It was the people you loved and who loved you back. It was the arms that held you when you needed comfort, the kiss that greeted you every morning, the quiet companionship of shared years and shared dreams. It was Flynn and their children and the life they had built together out of loneliness and courage and hope. And it was perfect. As they finally rose to go inside, Flynn pulled Willa close one more time, holding her tight against his chest. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "Always have, always will." "I love you too," Willa whispered back. "Thank you for fixing that problem all those years ago. Thank you for teaching me what it means to be held, to be loved, to be home." "Best thing I ever did," Flynn said, and kissed her under the stars, the same way he'd kissed her 1,000 times before and would kiss her 1,000 times more. Because some promises were meant to be kept forever, and some love stories never really end. They just keep unfolding, season after season, year after year, chapter after beautiful chapter, until the very end and beyond.